This exercise deals with the entry and processing of multiple response data. Now, quite often in survey research, questionnaires may contain questions which give respondents the option of selecting multiple categories. The example given here looks at those aspects of store layout or design which appeal to respondents. Respondents were given the option of selecting one or more of the four categories listed: color, spacing, dressing rooms, and lighting. Now, the best way of dealing with this type of data is to enter each category as a separate variable. So I've created a variable for each of the four categories associated with the question. Now, each variable is in turn measured on a dichotomous nominal scale using yes/no responses. Now, if a respondent selected color and spacing, then you would simply code it as yes for each of those two and no for the other variables, for the other categories rather, that were not selected. So you pretty much are gonna have to fragment that data set. You're gonna have to fragment the categories and make each category a variable. Now, you'll also notice that all the variable names have the question number entered to remind the analyst that these categories belong to the same question or variable. I'll just expand this a little. Right, so that number here is actually the question number, and this was clearly question 12 on that questionnaire. And it is just to underscore the association between these variables. Now, to create the multiple response data set, I will actually go and go to Analyze, Multiple Response, and I'm gonna go to Define Variable Sets. Now, in Define Variables, in this option here, you notice that frequencies and crosstabs are not activated. But let's go to Define Variable Sets, and then we'll get back to building our frequencies. Now, in Define Variable Sets, you are now going to have to select all those variables, all those categories from amongst all the data that will be displayed in the data set. You're going to have to select those categories which you are going to be using for the multiple response data set. And of course, if our data had more variables, for example, gender, age, and everything else that was on the questionnaire, we'd see a much longer list here. But I've isolated the four variables that we're going to be working with for the purposes of simplicity. So I'm going to select all four variables and send it into the variables in set box. Now, when that happens, I have to come here on the dichotomies to identify which value I want as my counted value. Now, it is logical that my counted value really in this case should be yes, so it should be 1. So it should be all those who responded yes to that question. I am instructing SPSS to count those in my multiple response data set. So the counted value here is 1 or yes. Now, of course, you have to enter a name, and entering the name is much like it follows the same conventions as entering the abbreviated name in the variable view. And so I'll call this variable combined attributes. Combined attributes. Let's just call it combined at. And the label combined. And let's just call the label attributes of store layout. Now, when that is complete, we simply select add. Now, add is going to create that new variable combined at, and that combined attributes variable that we created. And I'm going to close this dialog box. When I close this dialog box, My variable is not going to appear in my data view, and neither will it appear in my variable view. A little bit atypical when we compare it to the other situations that we were working with in SPSS earlier. Now, that's because using the multiple response data, it creates what we describe as a hidden variable. And even if I go to graphs, or let's go to analyze description statistics frequencies, if I try to attempt frequencies from this dialog box, it will not give me that option. So I have to attempt frequencies from the multiple response, and here we find that the frequencies are actually activated. No, this option is activated, frequencies and crosstabs. And here is my multiple response set. I send it over into the tables box and select OK. Now when that is complete, there we have it. That is the table that actually combines all the responses that were selected. Now here in the valid number, it shows you the number of cases, which is 47, and that is actually my sample size, right? Missing cases 3. Now the total here, 50, is a combination of both those that responded and the missing. So my total sample size is actually 50, but 47 responded to these questions. Now, if we look here, we notice that the most popular response was spacing, and this is the table is separated into percentages as it relates to responses and percentages as it relates to the cases. This 33.3%, however, represents 76.6% of all cases. So that 36 persons that selected spacing, if you divide 36 by 47, you would get 77.6%. And so you can make your analysis on that basis. Now, if you look at this n here, this total for n, 108, is more than our sample, and that is because we're taking into consideration all of the responses. So you're going to have more responses than your sample size because many individuals ticked more than one. The polar opposite is true as well. If you have less, if you have very few individuals taking any of the categories, or many individuals taking only one and some leaving nothing out, leaving nearly all the categories out, then it is possible that you could have less than the the total sample. So that's it for working with multiple response data set. And of course, you can do many of the same operations that you would do when you're working with your other variables. So that's it.